To start the session today, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners on the various lands on which we meet today, and also pay my respects to their leaders, past, present and emerging. In terms of the presentation today, we are continuing to use Zoom. We know that does cause some challenges for people compared to the Teams environment, but the last time we tried to use Teams for a superannuation briefing, we had a range of technological problems. We did have some challenges today in relation to the registration form for some processes in relation to the registration, which we think is a server problem and in terms of firewalls. So we hope that should have been fixed, but we will go back and review that. In terms of the process today, we are going to try and get through a presentation within the half hour, which is the preferred length of time from people, and we'll try and cover the questions through the chat process. And I apologise if I start to speed up towards the end of the presentation if we haven't got through everything that we wanted to. So in terms of the one of the major topics that we had people asking us about, and clearly in relation to both the current lockdown and quarantine programs occurring in the southeast corner, has been in relation to the process that we're still talking about as return to office, but clearly is about the ability for people to work from home. As we briefed people last time, move the screen around. As we briefed people last time, what we have been talking about in terms of a broader engagement with government is thinking about how do we provide certainty for people in relation to working from home arrangements, but also looking forward to try and develop a new public sector and public service approach to work compared to where we were in 2019. So we don't lose some of the benefits that we achieved through the enforced lockdown period in 2020. So this is a slide of what we talked about last time in terms of how we were going to escalate the engagement with government. Where we've got to since then, and since the last process, has been a series of agency level engagements around what return to office looked like and what the future of working from home looked like. And then last week we had the first central consultative committee meeting occurred, and now we're looking at how we're then able to leverage that process to come up with a new normal and a better system of industrial regulation for people who are working from home and want to do that. So I think in terms of that process, just see if we can move the screen around. In terms of that process, what we've been looking at is thinking through the return to office, but particularly given the Delta strain impact and the fact that the government's announcements about returning to 100% normality as they determined it, but given the kind of need to keep coffee shops open in the CBD, has meant that the broader engagement process and the politics of how we are talking to government about this certainly has changed over the last couple of weeks. What we saw in the first part of the kind of return to office program was really a conversation where there were significant variations between agencies. We had some agencies that were being very proactive and supportive of the return to office arrangements, and we saw particularly some of the larger employers such as Education Queensland having quite a kind of proactive approach, and also having an approach where they were recognising the value from the employees as well as the employer in relation to that kind of return to office and working from home arrangements. But what we also then saw in a number of agencies was that there was a significant variation about what was being said as opposed to what was being done. And I think particularly there was a significant gap in terms of our engagement with those departments, where they were saying one thing in writing and one thing the Director Generals were saying, which was around, we support work from home, we really want to have this process go forward, and the people should be filling in their individual flexibility arrangements. And the fact was that the reality of what was going on in those workplaces and those agencies was that there was local management intimidating people to say that isn't what actually should be occurring, and that if you're a good employer, you should only put in an application that is consistent with what the employer wanted you to do. So therefore they would approve all the applications as long as the applications were within their kind of parameters of 1 day a week or 1 day a fortnight in terms of that process. So there was a very large and significant gap in terms of that engagement with a range of departments. We raised it with the Directors General, we raised it through the consultative committees, but there was still very large-scale differences between what we knew was occurring in workplaces and what the departments were willing to admit was occurring in workplaces. And certainly the higher you got up within management, the less they were connected to the reality of what was the conversation with local supervisors, particularly in the Brisbane CBD, and particularly in 1 William Street, where we saw more significant pressure being put on by local managers who felt the only way they could manage staff is if they could see them, and were unwilling to take a more realistic approach towards having people working from home. So in terms of that process, we then escalated that process to the process around, sorry, I'm not sure what you can see there, in terms of the central consultative negotiations, and really then thinking through the ability to centrally talk through the process of of the difference between what was happening at the agency level and what was happening at the local level, and trying to convince them that there was a vast difference in terms of that process. So what we really were trying to then get from that process is there is now a commitment from the Public Service Commission and the Office of Industrial Relations to sit down and negotiate a new matrix and framework for how the negotiations should occur at the agency level. And that new matrix that there is broad acceptance of from the central agencies out of the consultative committee process for a conversation about where are people able to work from home or not, because clearly most public sector workers in schools and in the hospital system aren't able to work from home. If you are able to work from home and you're able to work from home in 2020, what does that look like in terms of appropriate mix in terms of time? And then secondly, if there are team-based environments, how do you have a team-based structure that allows us to undertake that process? So what we're keen to get is from feedback from members out of today and also at an agency level is to what extent there has been pressure being placed on you at the local level to be able to get to actually put in an application with a predetermined outcome rather than an application that reflects what would suit you in terms of that process. So what we're asking people today is if you're able to give us some indications as to where that pressure is being applied. We know that is true in a number of agencies, and we've spoken to members and delegates about that, but that is really going to be a significant process moving forward to make sure that we don't have a whitewashing of the process whereby employers say that they have agreed to every application made because they've been able to make sure people only apply for what's going to be pre-approved, rather than having a situation that we know that there will be people apply and get knocked back because of that process. But if everybody, it's like a North Korean election, if everybody applies and approves, we know that people weren't really applying for what they wanted, which is the kind of a preferred approach in some agencies. So thanks for that feedback today. Clearly, we've got some significant support across that process, and we're seeing about 54% of people who are in that process kind of indicating that there is continuing to be significant problems. So beyond that, what we're then hoping in terms of the process is what we then want to be able to achieve is move from a previous environment in 2019 to something more appropriate for 2022. And what that really looks like is a new industrial environment and a new industrial framework. And in terms of that, that's about the ability to work from home, about the ability to get decisions which are equitable in terms of the ability to make sure that there is a choice that is based not on favouritism, either within the work group or at an individual level in terms of access to work from home. But I think one of the other issues that's certainly come out of over the last kind of week or so in the lead up to today's presentation has also been in relation to access to flexible work hours. So that's certainly a number of members have indicated to us that at a local level and a departmental level, there continues to be issues in relation to people not being able to build up excess hours and have that ability to have flexible work arrangements in terms of building up ADO time and flexi time, and then taking that time off while they're working from home, just as they would be while they're working from the office. We also need to include, in terms of a future environment from 2022 and the future, is to continue to recognise the challenges that we are going to face with COVID into the future about the ability of vulnerable workers to be able to have their safety protected in anything that they do. And particularly over the last kind of week, as we've moved back into a lockdown environment, what we've seen is that the issue around vulnerable workers continues to be a significant one. And at agencies, while they were kind of brought to the table last year in terms of definition of vulnerable workers, there clearly needs to be the capacity, if there are short, sharp lockdowns into the future, that vulnerable worker status remains a key component, and that when we do start to return to office, that there is a clear understanding that there is a component of the workforce who are at more health risks than others, and that COVID is not going to go away in the medium term, and that we continue to do everything we can to protect them. And I think also the other issues in relation to a future industrial environment will be about sustainability, so we don't have to have the flexible work arrangements that are done on a regular rolling basis, but once those decisions are made, you're able to lock them in for longer periods, so people can plan their lives around childcare, around working from home, around work and family in a meaningful way, rather than having a 3-month ticking time bomb that could completely change their working lives and that. So we are keen to get some feedback from members today about in relation to how much access people are having to flexible work arrangements, whether for those people who are working from home, whether they're having any difficulties, and whether that is an issue that is key to some agencies, or whether the better employers are able to have that process. So we'll keep that up on screen for a little while till we get to the next slide. And I think then the major issue is moving forward is how we then have a transparent and realistic appeals mechanism, and also a decision-based matrix for those processes. So I think that we'll be trying to take out the work from home arrangements from the kind of flexible work arrangements that exist under the Industrial Relations Act, because they are too short term, but also they are saying that you're varying from the norm in terms of those individual flexibility arrangements. What we want to be establishing from now on is that working from home is the norm. It's about how much time you're able to work from home, rather than seeing the individual flexibility arrangements and the case law that's been established around those, meaning that it is something that is quite strange and quite different. So I think in terms of what we're seeing is that the flexible work arrangements are not consistent across agencies. What we see, like in terms of that process, it does look like the majority of agencies are doing the right thing, and we'll be able to get some detail out of that based on the outcomes from today, and we'll follow up on a department by department basis process. In terms of other issues that then came up at the first consultative committee meeting last week, was in relation to the issue of indirect labour hire, and so it was part of the processes from the government in relation to the savings and debt plan. We were able to negotiate with government that they should be looking at direct employment. Clearly, the movement from contractors, consultants into direct employment is a challenge in relation to the staffing cap and the FTE cap. But one of the other issues that we identified through the Central Consultative Committee is potentially a loophole in relation to how departments are reporting back to central agencies in relation to the definition of contractors and consultants for the purposes of that broader reporting, and particularly in relation to where labour hire companies are being employed to employ people, particularly at the administrative stream at the lower levels, particularly as a result of the staffing cap, meaning that it is hard to have those entry-level positions being recruited to. And there is a loophole that potentially exists within the definitions used by the old Department of Public Works and Housing about their standard offer arrangement, which would mean that labour hire arrangements, kind of AO2, AO3 labour hire arrangements, wouldn't be classified through that public works and housing definition. And if that definition was then being used as it is for the definition for reporting to the central agencies and Queensland Treasury in relation to the way that the contractors and consultants money is being reported, we have indicated we think that there is significant labour hire in some agencies, in justice and in Cheddar and in housing parts of Cheddar that needs to be addressed. So we are going to be coming back to members between now and the next Central Consultative Committee in October, looking for the specifics of where labour hire is being used, then being able to raise that at the Agency Consultative Committee, not only to address why it's being used, but also to see, is the agency telling the truth to the central agencies in their reporting process, and then being able to, at the central agency committee level, to be able to talk that bit through. The other major issues that are ongoing at the moment in terms of public sector reform in relation to that process is in relation to the review of the Public Service Act. That has now been to Cabinet, and the major working parties are now up and running and have been meeting over the next couple of weeks. We are on track, I believe, to have it go back to Cabinet for approval for full drafting and tabling in the House early next year, and the ability to have a new Public Service Act tabled in the first half of next year prior to the public sector bargaining rounds occurring. And the major areas are in relation to the scope of the Act, governance, employment rights and equity. In terms of the scope of the Act, this doesn't probably apply much to people on today's briefing in relation to existing public servants, but there are a large number of public sector employees, statutory authority employees who are in a kind of halfway house, sometimes covered by the regulations of the Public Service Commission, but not covered by the Public Service Act. So we are trying to work through with government a more consistent arrangements in relation to where the public service employment rights should apply without necessarily making everybody public servants, and that work is continuing. Secondly, we are then looking at also the management of the public sector, and that really relates to issues in relation to how the Public Service Board exists, what is the relationship between government and at a ministerial level, what is the role of the Public Service Commission, what is the role of the Public Service Board, because that is an area which is quite grey at the moment, but also making sure that there is the capacity for clarity about those centralised decisions as opposed to agency-based decisions. And also, I think in terms of this process, trying to address the issue of workplace bullying that continues to be a major problem for public sector workers across the board. There is currently some provisions in the Industrial Relations Act about stopping bullying orders. They have been spectacularly unsuccessful in this process. So what we're seeking to do through the Public Service Act process is to establish a new process to allow for a collective approach to inappropriate behaviour by management, and talk about that as a collective approach to workplace culture. The reason we're talking about this is while we think management are continuing to be bullies, what we want to do is have the ability for workers as a group to be able to put up their hand and say to senior management, the culture in this workplace is wrong, and have an earlier intervention into the process to try and fix the problem and change the behaviour of managers. The ability, I think, in terms of this process is also to say for senior management that they can tell local level management that they're doing the wrong thing, they're behaving inappropriately without necessarily convicting them of being a bully, because that kind of structural process has meant that the departments have recognised in some places the wrong thing is being done, but we haven't got an avenue to allow for the majority of workers to come forward and say, we want a better workplace, we want to talk about how managers treat staff in a generic sense, rather than using the existing bullying structures, which requires someone to be effectively determined to be a bully before change occurs. There is a range of behaviour that should be stopped and intervention that should occur before someone necessarily, the kind of psychopath, middle managers are convicted of being bullying. There's a range of other options we think that needs to be done, because clearly the current environment isn't working. Beyond that, then there is the tranche of work that we've been trying to escalate in terms of employment security for public sector workers, and thinking through what that looks like, particularly about making the permanency the default rather than the exception. So moving away from the successes we've had about converting temporaries to permanent, to trying to set up a process where people are employed on a permanent basis to start with. And then particularly in relation to that, also seeking to change the problem at the moment around the interaction between the criminal justice, the CCC process, and official misconduct versus discipline within the Public Service Act, where people kind of get bounced between the two, and very lengthy investigations that occur and people are removed from the workplace, rather than having a more clear and transparent process where there is a misconduct alleged, that allegation and investigation is handled quickly, succinctly, and within the processes within the Public Service Act, rather than getting bounced around to the CCC and having never-ending investigations that leave people completely out to dry. Particularly, justice needs to be done, needs to be seen to be done, but also needs not to be delayed, which is a real problem for our members. And the final part of the kind of Public Service Act review will be around the Equity Working Party, that hopefully will deal with some of the issues around pay equity, and looking at some of the underlying issues around that, which will also be covered by the Industrial Relations Act, but also overlapping with the Industrial Relations Act review, about looking at the role of EEO committees that we used to have prior to the current Public Service Act, and looking at the issue of sexual harassment referral officers, and looking at some longer term challenges around that. So that'll be also caught up in the Industrial Relations Act review, that in terms of that process, we will be able to try and work through and hopefully get some solutions in relation to that. The other issues we just wanted to touch base on today was in relation to, with the lockdown, there has been an announcement in relation to the Ekka being cancelled, but also that the Ekka public holiday has now been suspended or removed in relation to Brisbane and the Scenic Rim. The Scenic Rim was Monday, the broader Brisbane area was next Wednesday. That has now been suspended, or will be suspended by regulation. The government has said publicly that they will be reinstituting that as a new public holiday later in the year. We assume that will be based on where COVID is at and the lockdowns are at. So we'll be hoping to see we'll be certainly pursuing that with government once the current lockdown has ended. So at the moment, that will have some impact in relation to rosters and people's penalty rates for next week if you are a shift worker and have been put on for either in the Scenic Rim Brisbane or in Monday, or Scenic Brisbane on Wednesday. So that will be a change for a range of people. The other two issues that we wanted to touch base with was in relation to vaccination leave. So the ACTU and the Queensland Council of Unions, which we're affiliated to, have been pursuing vaccination leave. Clearly, one of the longer term solution to the COVID situation and the pandemic is higher vaccination rates. And we need to do everything we can to encourage people to follow the science and undertake vaccinations where appropriate for them. But in terms of that process, one of the economic barriers to that is the ability to take time off to get vaccination leave. So in terms of that, at the moment, a number of private sector employers have stepped forward and are providing vaccination leave. Certainly in the airlines industry, we've seen a lot of support for it. At the moment, we haven't seen any movement from the government on that. But prior to pursuing that with the government at a state level, we were wanting to get feedback from members about whether you felt it was appropriate to pursue vaccination leave for workers in the public service. And I think that we have a poll that we can launch on that, which would also be in relation to the ability to see whether workers and members think that we should be supporting vaccination leave for public sector workers. I know a number of people have already been vaccinated, but in terms of a general view is from the movement, from the ACTU and the QCU, is that vaccination leave would increase vaccination rates. It hasn't been something that has been a key issue for us outside of disabilities, but we were wanting to get some feedback from members about whether you felt this was something that was appropriate for us to continue to pursue. So I think that's reasonably clear in terms of those processes where we're at, and we'll take that on board in terms of the process with significant support for that process. The last piece we just wanted to touch on in terms of the process is around the fact that the Queensland government has now successfully bid for the 2032 Olympics. That is a significant issue potentially in the medium term in relation to this process. From Together Office point of view and my point of view, I think while the Olympics are great things to watch on TV, the question is about whether the Queensland government will go broke conducting the Olympics, but also the question in relation to whether or not, with a significant budgetary challenge post-COVID, whether or not the debate around how we're going to fund the Olympics should be undertaken, and also whether you see it as appropriate for Together to be in the space of seeking to have a conversation with government about protecting public sector services and public sector jobs from the issues in relation to the Olympics. So what we saw in relation to the Commonwealth Games was that the government decided, because of the FTE cap, that the Commonwealth Games were a great idea, but there was all this spare potential in the public sector because public servants were sitting around twiddling their thumbs with nothing to do. And so agencies were required to release part of their FTE cap to move to the Commonwealth government, to move to the Commonwealth Games agency. And in some cases where they couldn't release staff, they were required to release part of their budget. And our perception in the union office at the moment is that public sector workloads continue to be an issue, particularly in the savings and debt environment. And so in terms of that, we think that I certainly think that there is value in being part of this conversation. We are looking at commissioning some research by the Australia Institute for release later this year in terms of the process around the kind of how we would come up with budget principles moving forward that would protect the rest of the sector from the Olympics, and also to think about what it looks like in terms of infrastructure spend to make sure that regional infrastructure and health infrastructure aren't compromised by significant expenditure on stadiums and other things that are relevant for the Olympics. So we wanted to get some feedback from members today as to whether that was something that you thought was appropriate, but in terms of that process, kind of leaving it till later in the year, and particularly after the lockdown. And I think that's the broad support from people in relation to that process. So that's kind of where we wanted to cover off most of the issues for today. What we want to do is continue to have these kind of monthly Zooms for people in the public service and to try and provide a timely and accurate information to you. But we're also trying to work out the best way of being able to continue to build a stronger union in the workplace and to provide some information to both members and non-members in this process. So we're also keen to try and get feedback from people about where their people are able to provide some support or capacity to get engaged with the union, and also to then work out where there are some options in relation to if you find that these sort of monthly meetings are helpful to you, whether you're also in a position to get more involved. And as we know, that the ability of the union to win for workers is based on the support of members and delegates across the sector. And what we're looking at is particularly in the public service areas prior to the kind of the Corey being a couple of years, what is the best way of developing that engagement and strength across the CBD and across the public service. So if you are able to participate, if you can kind of give us some indications from the Zoom about what are the best ways you think that would be helpful for us in terms of our organisational planning and being able to give you more ability to get involved in your workplace. So I'm not sure if we've been able to cover all the questions on the chat today. We are a bit limited on the basis of being working remotely ourselves in the union office, and I'm also caught with the requirements of quarantining given my children, my son goes to Ironside. So I hope we have been able to get the technology to work for you today. We certainly would encourage people to continue to participate, and we'll continue to do these on the first Wednesday of every month. And if you are, then we'll do a follow-up survey out of today to ask you if you have feedback about how we could do things differently and whether there are other issues that you think that we should be covering. If there was questions that you asked beforehand that we didn't cover today, given the time lengths, we will be getting back to all of those individual questions, and that'll always be the case with each of these. But please take time to fill in the survey if you're able to provide some support for the ongoing activities in the workplace. But later today or tomorrow, you'll get a follow-up email asking what you thought worked well, what you thought didn't work well, and suggestions you have for the future, so we can continue to make these as valuable as possible. But we're kind of 5 minutes over time now, so that'll be the end for today. We'll leave the screen up if people have got some capacity to give us some feedback. But thanks everybody for your time. I hope I didn't speak too fast today, and we'll try and hopefully see you in 1 month's time online. Thanks everybody for support so far, and stay safe, and hopefully we'll be getting back to out of lockdown sooner rather than later.